am attorney Marie-Chris Bathan-Lasco. This is my virtual classroom. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this channel, I shall aim to simplify the law. I will discuss concepts and principles of law in under 10 minutes. Hi again, everyone. Welcome to MBL Classroom. For this video, I want us to talk about what would be the effect of having a contract between a corporation and one of their directors or trustees or officers. And also, what would be the effect of a contract between two corporations with interlocking directors. So, let's begin. Now, let's talk about first contracts entered into between a corporation and one of the directors or trustees or officers, or even the spouse of any of the director, trustee, or officer, or a relative within the fourth degree of consanguinity or affinity of any such director, trustee, or officer. Now, what do we call such director, trustee, or officer who is entering into a contract with a corporation? What do we call them? We actually call them the self-dealing directors or trustees. We also call them self-dealing directors or trustees even if the contract was not entered into between the corporation and them. We still call them self-dealing directors or trustees even if the contract was entered into between the corporation or their spouse, or between the corporation or their relative or relatives within the fourth degree of consanguinity or affinity. Now, what is the status of the contract entered into between a corporation and a self-dealing director or trustee or a self-dealing officer? As a general rule, that contract is voidable. Are there contracts entered into between a corporation and a self-dealing director or trustee or officer that would be considered as valid? Yes, there are. However, Section 31 of your revised corporation code requires certain circumstances to be present for that contract to be considered as valid. What are these circumstances? Let's take a look at Section 31. It states, a contract of the corporation with one or more of its directors, trustees, officers, or their spouses and relatives within the fourth civil degree of consanguinity or affinity is voidable at the option of such corporation, unless all of the following conditions are present. A, the presence of such director or trustee in the board meeting in which the contract was approved was not necessary to constitute a quorum for such meeting. B, the vote of such director or trustee was not necessary for the approval of the contract. C, the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances. D, in case of corporations vested with public interest, material contracts are approved by at least 2/3 of the entire membership of the board, with at least a majority of the independent directors voting to approve the material contract. And E, in case of an officer, the contract has been previously authorized by the board of directors. That is the first part of Section 31, where you see that as a general rule, contracts entered into between a corporation and any self-dealing director, trustee, or officer becomes voidable at the option of the corporation. It becomes valid if the conditions enumerated therein are present. Let's talk about these conditions. The first condition says that the presence of that self-dealing director or trustee must not be necessary to constitute a quorum in that meeting where the contract was approved. What does this mean? Let me give you an illustration for you to understand condition number 1. So if there are 10 directors and you have Director A, who is the self-dealing director. In the meeting where the contract was approved, for example, there were 7 directors who were present out of 10. 7 directors out of 10 clearly constitutes a quorum because that's 1/2 plus 1. Is the presence of A necessary to constitute a quorum? So let's have the 7. If this is A and he was present in the quorum, if A will not be counted in the meeting, will there still be a quorum? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Are they still in a quorum? The answer is yes. So the first condition then is present, because the presence of A is not necessary to constitute a quorum, there having been 7 out of 10 who were present, such that out of the 7, if A was included in the 7, even if he was not present there would still be 6, and that would still constitute a quorum. That is what is meant by the first condition. Second condition says that the vote of that self-dealing director or trustee was not necessary for the approval of the contract. Now let's go back to our example earlier on, where there were 7 directors who were present, and among them was your A, who is the self-dealing director. Now, since they're in a quorum, of course, they can conduct business and they can actually vote on the approval of the contract with A. Now, from the 7, if 4 voted to approve the contract, because what is needed is, again, still just the majority. If 4 voted to approve, and among the 4 who voted is A, so the 4 voted, is A's vote necessary to approve the contract in that example? The answer is yes. Why? Because if you remove A, then that would only have been 3 who voted. And the 3 out of 7 is clearly not the majority. How about if from the 7 who attended the meeting, 5 voted to approve the contract and 2 voted not to approve it? And among the 5 who voted, A voted also to approve it. If you remove A from the equation, from the 5 who voted, would the contract still be approved if there were 7 of them there? So you have only 4 who approved? The answer is yes, because 4 out of 7 is still the majority. In other words, the vote of A is not needed to approve the contract. So that is condition number 2. Condition number 3 is that the contract must be fair and reasonable under the circumstances. In other words, had it been another person whom the corporation is dealing with, it would have been more or less the same terms and conditions. It must be fair and reasonable. What is condition number 4? Condition number 4 requires, in corporations vested with public interest, that in case of material contracts entered into with self-dealing directors or trustees, it must be approved by at least 2/3 of the entire membership of the board. It is not based on the quorum or not based on the members present during the meeting in the approval of the contract, but rather it is based on the entire membership. In other words, it must be 2/3 of the entire membership of the board. Additionally, condition number 4 under section 31 requires that at least a majority of the independent directors must have also approved the contract. Condition number 5 specifically applies to contracts entered into by the corporation with their officers. In case of officers, for it to be valid, there must be authorization by the board of directors to make that contract valid. So that's basically the first part of Section 31. Now, what is the second part of Section 31? The second part of Section 31 actually gives you the requisites provided for by law to still make the contract valid even if one of the first three conditions are absent from the five that we have mentioned. So, in other words, your revised corporation code will still allow the contract to be considered as valid even if any of the first three conditions are absent. What does the second part of Section 31 say? It says, where any of the first three conditions set forth in the preceding paragraph is absent, in the case of a contract with a director or trustee, such contract may be ratified by the vote of the stockholders representing at least 2/3 of the outstanding capital stock or of at least 2/3 of the members in a meeting called for the purpose, provided that full disclosure of the adverse interests of the directors or trustees involved is made at such meeting and the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances. So what does that tell you? When you actually read the second part of Section 31, it tells you first that the contract must always be fair and reasonable under the circumstances. In other words, your Section 31, while it says that if any of the first three conditions are absent, where number one, that the presence of the self-dealing director is not necessary to constitute a quorum. The second condition is that the approval of the vote of the self-dealing director is not necessary for the approval of the contract. And third is that it must be fair and reasonable under the circumstances. When you actually read the second part of Section 31, the third condition must always be present because your second part of Section 31 actually makes that a requirement. So that brings us to the first two conditions. In other words, if any of the first two conditions are absent, as what we have mentioned, your contract with the self-dealing director can actually still be considered as valid if it is ratified by the stockholders or members. And such ratification requires a vote of at least 2/3 of the outstanding capital stock if a stock corporation, or at least 2/3 of the members if a non-stock corporation. Now, how about contracts between two corporations with interlocking directors or trustees? What is the status of that contract between these two corporations? The answer to that question can be found in the next provision, your Section 32 of the Revised Corporation Code. Let's take a look at Section 32. It provides, except in cases of fraud and provided the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances, a contract between two or more corporations having interlocking directors shall not be invalidated on that ground alone, provided that if the interest of the interlocking director in one corporation is substantial and the interest in the other corporation or corporations is merely nominal, the contract shall be subject to the provisions of the preceding section insofar as the latter corporation or corporations are concerned. Stock holdings exceeding 20% of the outstanding capital stock shall be considered substantial for purposes of interlocking directors. So first, what is an interlocking director? An interlocking director is where between two corporations having a contract with each other, that director is a director in one corporation and is also a director of that other corporation. So, if ABC Corporation is having a contract with XYZ Corporation. You have one director who is also a director in ABC and also a director in XYZ Corporation. Now, with that example, is the contract between ABC and XYZ considered as valid? Section 32 says, so long as there is no fraud involved and the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances, the general rule is the contract between ABC and XYZ is considered as valid, even if you have an interlocking director. That's the general rule. What is the exception? The exception is that it becomes voidable if that director has a nominal interest in one corporation and a substantial interest in the other corporation. Let me give you an example. You have ABC Corporation and then you have XYZ Corporation. They enter into a contract with each other. And then you have Mr. V. Mr. V is a director in ABC Corporation and is also a director in XYZ Corporation. Again, as a general rule, even if Mr. V is an interlocking director in the two corporations, the general rule is the contract between the two corporations is considered as valid. It is considered as voidable only when Mr. V has a nominal interest in one corporation and a substantial interest in another corporation. Now, what is considered as a nominal interest and what is considered as a substantial interest? Your Section 32 also tells you what is considered as a substantial interest in a corporation. Your Section 32 says that you are considered to have a substantial interest in the corporation if your interest exceeds 20%. So let's go back to our example with Mr. V. So you have ABC Corporation, where he is a director, and you have also XYZ Corporation, where he is also a director. If, for example, Mr. V's interest in ABC Corporation is 15% and his interest in XYZ Corporation is 25%, what does that tell you? That tells you that he has a nominal interest in ABC while a substantial interest in XYZ. What does Section 32 tell you if that is the case? It tells you that it now becomes voidable at the option of the corporation. Which corporation? It becomes voidable at the option of the corporation where Mr. V has a nominal interest. And in our example, your ABC Corporation. So what is the relevance now of knowing which corporation can treat it as voidable? Its relevance now is that we now follow the rules of the preceding provision or the rules under Section 31 on self-dealing directors. In other words, in ABC Corporation, they will now have to look at whether all the 5 conditions are present. If all the 5 conditions are present, then the contract is valid. If any of those conditions, first 3 conditions, are absent, then it may still be considered as valid if it is ratified by at least 2/3 of the outstanding capital stock or at least 2/3 of the members. Now, supposing Mr. V's interest in ABC Corporation is 25% and his interest in XYZ Corporation is 50%. Now, both his interests in the 2 corporations having a contract with each other are both substantial. What happens now? The contract is considered as valid and you do not apply the conditions required under Section 31 in any of the corporations. Another example, if the interest of Mr. V in ABC Corporation is 15%, and his interest in XYZ Corporation is 10%. In this example, the interest of Mr. V in both corporations are nominal. Do you apply Section 31 on the 5 conditions? The answer is no. It's considered as valid. Why do we say so? Because Section 32 only tells you that it becomes voidable where you follow Section 31 on the 5 conditions if the interest of the interlocking director is nominal in one corporation and is substantial in another. If both his interests are nominal in the 2 corporations or both his interests in the 2 corporations are substantial, then the contract entered into by the 2 corporations would be considered as valid. So that is Section 31 and Section 32 of the Revised Corporation Code. I hope I was able to simplify the concepts of self-dealing directors and also on interlocking directors. I hope you have learned again something new from this video, and I will see you in the next. So if you find this video helpful, please click like, subscribe, and that notification bell so that you will be notified of new video uploads. Thank you for watching. See you next time in MBL Classroom.